One of the biggest keys to using an overlock machine is understanding the tension dials. These dials control whether the stitch you use is a balanced stitch or an unbalanced one, or whether it's the stitch you need for the application at hand. Getting comfortable with the tension dials is a giant step in learning to sew with an overlock machine. You might want to use the sample stitches you learn as we go along to start a reference notebook. Write down the tension and other settings, fabric and threads that you use for a given stitch, and add to your book as you try different fabrics, threads, and techniques. In a balanced stitch, the upper and lower threads meet or knit at the edge of the fabric. Balanced stitches are generally used for basic construction applications such as sewing seams and overcasting the edges of seams and hems. You can sew a seam with either the 3 or 4 thread balanced stitch of your Brother Serger. If you're sewing a seam in woven fabric that won't be top stitched, it's often best to use a 4 thread stitch. The 4 thread balanced stitch produces a durable yet flexible seam. It uses both needles and both loopers. The 4 thread stitch is appropriate for sewing seams in both woven and knit fabrics. Let's sew a conventional seam that will be on the inside of our project. Thread both needles and loopers with sewing or serger thread. For medium weight fabric, set all 4 tension dials to 4. If the stitch is unbalanced, adjust the tension in one needle, then the other if needed. Then stitch. When sewing seams with an overlock machine, always let the knives trim some of the fabric. That way, you'll have neater edges and even stitches. You can stitch your seams in the conventional manner with right sides together, or place wrong sides together to create exposed seams. Use standard thread or decorative thread for exposed seams. Top stitch the seams to one side if you want them to lay flat. Use the balanced 4 thread stitch to stitch ribbing to your projects. Increase your stitch length and stitch with the ribbing on top. This allows the feed dogs to help ease the base fabric to the ribbing. Edge stitching or overcasting with your serger is the perfect way to prevent raveling of woven fabrics. Sew seams in heavy fabrics such as denim, corduroy, or velveteen with a standard sewing machine. Then, use a 4 thread stitch for a sturdy, secure seam finish. On medium weight fabric, seamed with a standard sewing machine, you can also serge seam allowances together, then press to one side. Create mock flat fill seams in medium to heavyweight fabric by straight stitching the seams, then serging the seam allowances together. Press them to one side. For extra security, thread the lower looper with fusible thread and fuse the seam allowances. Turn the fabric to the right side. Thread your sewing machine with heavy thread like buttonhole twist and top stitch through the seam allowances right next to the seam. Top stitch again about 1/4 of an inch away. Make sure you stitch through all layers. Shoulder and pocket seams will sometimes sag or stretch if not reinforced or stabilized. This is especially true when sewing knits. To prevent stretching, add twill tape to reinforce seams while stitching them. Thread your Brother Serger with sewing or serger thread. Choose normal tension settings. Place the twill tape on the seam line before stitching. You can use a dab of glue stick to keep it in place. Be sure that the strip is caught in the seam as you serge. For a less visible reinforcement, use sheer stay tape, narrow washable satin ribbon in a color that matches the fabric, or, for woven fabrics, cut a strip from the selvage and use it for stabilizing the seam. For a stabilized seam with a slight bit of stretch, use tricot bias binding. You can easily create soft gathers in lightweight fabric with the 4-thread stitch and the all-purpose foot. Finish one side of the fabric you're planning to gather with a narrow hem sewn on your sewing machine or a rolled hem created on your overlock machine. Increase the tension in both needles and turn your differential feed setting to 2.0. Set the stitch length to 4.0 and the width to 5.0. Serge the unfinished edge of the fabric, creating the ruffle. Then, add it to your project. Making pouches to fill with cosmetics, crayons, toys, paintbrushes, or anything you know the recipient will love creates a gift to be cherished. Personalizing the bag before stitching will give it that really special touch. Use a balanced 4-thread stitch to insert the zipper. Place the zipper on the fabric right sides together. Stitch through the zipper and the fabric, being careful of the zipper teeth. Stitch the seams with a conventional sewing machine and serge the seam edges. A balanced 3-thread seam has more stretch than a 4-thread seam, making it ideal for knits. Use the left needle for a wider stitch and the right needle for a narrow stitch. The weight of the fabric and the thread you're using in the loopers will dictate which to use. Set all tension dials to 4 and adjust the differential feed to between 0 and 2. Stitch length should be between 3 and 4, and the knife width should be between 4 and 5. For areas of your project that may receive extra stress, straight stitch along the needle line of the 3-thread stitch for a more secure seam. 3-thread stitches sewn with decorative thread are perfect for stitching exposed seams in sewing projects. Exposed seams become a part of your project's design, so tension and stitches should be perfect. Remember that decorative threads are often heavier and require tension adjustments. Heavier threads also need a longer stitch length. Always do test stitching with the project fabric, needles, and thread to perfect your tension settings before sewing the project. Securing seam ends is especially important when seams are exposed. Even when a seam is crossed by another seam, you may want to straight stitch along the stitching lines for a few inches with a standard sewing machine. If a seam will not be crossed by another seam, liquid seam sealant such as Fray Check or No Fray is the most aesthetically pleasing choice for securing the exposed seam. A balanced 3-thread stitch with a medium length is a perfect choice for sewing lingerie. By removing the stitch finger, you can achieve a very narrow seam. Remove the left needle and the removable stitch finger. Tension settings should start at 4, and differential feed settings should be in the normal range. Experiment with the upper and lower looper tensions to get just the right seams. The narrow 3-thread stitch is also a good choice for joining lace or adding lace to your projects. Stitch length should be between 2.5 and 3.5. Start with the tension settings at 4. With the left needle and the stitch finger removed, do a test stitch and adjust the tensions and differential feed if necessary. Soon you'll be easily adding lace to handkerchiefs, lingerie, and any number of other types of projects. A balanced 3-thread stitch is a perfect lightweight edge finish for light and medium weight fabrics. Straight stitch seams with a conventional machine and finish each seam edge with a 3-thread stitch. Or serge the seam allowances together and press to one side. When sewing seams and knits with a conventional machine, serge the seam edges first, then straight stitch the seam. You can press the seams open. Leave the seams like this or top stitch each side, an especially good procedure for interlock knits. Or press the seams to one side and top stitch with a single or double needle. Use decorative thread and edge stitch around double-faced polyester fleece, terry cloth, or other fabrics to create fast edge finishes and add embellishment at the same time. Thread both loopers with heavy thread like pearl crown rayon and use regular thread, buttonhole twist, or any appropriate thread in the left needle. Increase your stitch length and loosen the looper tensions. Don't forget to do a test stitching to get your tensions just right. Add an embroidery motif or monogram to your finished project to really make it one of a kind. All of your hems can look more professional when you use your Brother Overlock machine to stitch them. For woven fabrics, finish hem edges with a 3 or 4 thread balanced stitch. The weight of your fabric will dictate which one to choose. Then, turn up your hem and stitch with the blind hem stitch on your conventional machine. A few fabrics like velvet should be stitched by hand after you finish the edge of the hem. Finish the edge of knits with a 3-thread stitch, then turn up the hem allowance. Top stitch using a single, double, or even a triple needle. You can also use the multi-purpose foot to finish the edge and blind stitch the hem of both knits and wovens in one step with an unbalanced stitch. Replace the all-purpose foot with the multi-purpose foot. Remove the right needle. Set the stitch width to 5 and set the stitch length to between 3 and 4. Decrease the needle tension to between 0 and 2. Increase the upper looper tension to between 5 and 7. And decrease the lower looper tension to between 2 and 4. Place your fabric wrong side up with the hem facing away from you. Fold up the desired hem allowance, then fold the fabric back with about 1/4 inch of the hem edge exposed. Press the fold. Place your fabric under the foot and adjust the guide to where the fold is against the guide and the needle will drop right at the fold. Then serge the fabric. You'll need to do a test stitching as the guide placement depends on the fabric you're stitching. When you're finished, turn the fabric to find a tiny row of ladder stitching. The stitches will be more noticeable on thin knits and almost invisible on heavier knits. Be sure to use a smaller needle on lightweight fabric.